context for today's meeting is really, I think, quite straightforward. There's obviously a really thriving SME sector in the UAE, high concentrations of that in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai. The SMEs make a significant contribution in economic terms as well as employment terms to the economy of the UAE, but the UAE isn't unique in that. The SMEs suffer from a lack of access to funding. That is, in fact, a problem we see in many parts of the world, but it's a problem that exists here as well. And given the importance of SMEs to the economy and the role SME development in particular plays in the Vision 2021, it is perhaps an obvious, or at least certainly an important idea to consider the possibility of supporting funding to the sector by putting in place a market, a secondary market for SMEs. So that is what we want to talk about today. What's the rationale for this? What are the constraints? What are the benchmarks and case studies that we can draw on? And how would we go about exploring and detailing this idea in particular? So that's what we will do. We've been talking for about 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully have a little bit of time for question and answers and engagement. Just briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but so you can put this in context, let me introduce briefly Oliver Wyman to you, so you have an understanding of where what we will be talking about in the next 40 minutes, where that comes from. Oliver Wyman is a strategic consulting firm. We service the full breadth of sectors, but financial services is really our core and our history and where we come from. So this is where we spend the majority of our time, over 1,000 professionals worldwide, focusing exclusively on financial services. Two areas that we're particularly distinguished in are the areas of public policy and market infrastructure. And here we service many of the leading institutions around the world, whether it is the European Central Bank, whether it is the FCA in the UK on the public policy side, or whether it is Deutsche Börse and the LSE on the market infrastructure side. We've been working with these institutions and bring that kind of insight and expertise to this work. And in addition to that, we know the environment in the UAE very well. All of us spend, well, these two gentlemen live here, but all of us spend the majority of our time working in the region, and therefore we can put all of this into context. So let me, I was saying that we've done a lot of work in particular the area of SME promotion, and then in addition to that, the idea and the operationalization of SME markets. So there are three examples that briefly I'd like to highlight here to give you a feel for the range of insight and work that happens, that we bring to the table. We've been working extensively with the World Bank and the IFC on SME development. Both of these institutions, as you appreciate, have a great interest in SME sector development. And so we've been working on a methodology which we will bring to bear in this context as well, around really identifying the SME funding gap. That's the starting point for the question of how do we fund SMEs. Because first of all, you need to figure out what is actually the gap, the extent of underfunding we need to be addressing. And so this is a methodology that we've developed together with the IFC and the World Bank that quantifies what is the actually sustainable amount of funding, the optimal amount of funding for the SME sector, and then contrast that with the actual funding available. So you come out with a gap, and that is what we then deploy various strategies, including potentially a secondary market, to address that funding gap. The example here comes from the United Kingdom, where we've advised the government, but we've done this elsewhere. We've done it in a number of mature and emerging markets. Now, oftentimes when looking at how to address the funding gaps for the SME sector, one quickly gets onto the fact that the SME sector development has a broader range of issues, policy issues, that need to be assessed and perhaps addressed in parallel. So here's an example of something that we've done fairly recently. In fact, working for the Saudi authorities, where we looked at a comprehensive framework for the SME policy environment, looking not only at the financing, but also, so the financing, sorry, this house is a little small, but in the center pillar there would be the financing, and in the left and right would be other types of initiative or policy framework elements to support the development of the SME sector. And often one has to look at that in a comprehensive manner. Similar work we've done again for the government in the UK, but also other financial centers like, for instance, Bermuda or financial centers in Asia. So we've got a methodology to assess the funding gap, we've got a framework here, and the benchmarks to look at the overall policy environment. And then we come on to the issue that is sort of the more specific issue in question for today, which is really the setup and design of a market for SME listings and trading of SMEs. Here we've in fact, and I'm going to ask Paul in a second to detail this a little further, but in fact we have had an opportunity to look at the potential for a regional SME platform for the Middle East and Africa region. This was commissioned by a set of investors just a couple of years ago. This would have been based in the UAE, as a matter of fact. So we've gone through that thought process. It was directed not only at the UAE SME sector, but at the broader Middle East and Africa. But based on that, there's in fact a lot of intellectual capital that we would bring together. Paul, do you want to say a few more words about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this gives a real example of the work which we would look to leverage as part of assessing the ability to set up a SME or a secondary market platform for the UAE. This, as Dominic said, was to look at more of a pan-regional SME platform, which would encompass the GCC and the North Africa region. The work which we did was a small team of equity investors. We were looking to set up a platform really to support the broad combination of SMEs that exist in these markets. Clearly, there are a number of challenges to set up a pan-regional platform as opposed to a single jurisdiction platform. This would obviously entail alignment of regulations, listing processes, investor regulations, taxation for some of the markets that have tax. Some of the markets we also looked at had foreign currency restrictions in terms of flows of cash. I think in terms of the insights that we can draw from this, setting up a single jurisdiction SME platform is certainly easier to do. We also have quite a detailed database, not only on the UAE markets, but also some of the GCC markets, in terms of the SME population, in terms of the potential set of companies that could be viable for listing on a secondary platform in the UAE. I think also from the work that we did quite a lot of detailed analysis around potential design structures for an SME platform. This includes a business case, the commercial viability, the operating model structure of any platform that would exist. So clearly we have a lot of insights which we would look to utilize and leverage for looking at a secondary market for the UAE market. Just as a continuation on that, I wanted to also highlight that we translated a lot of the practical experience that we have in looking at SME financing challenges, as well as looking at setting up new SME secondary market platforms into thought leadership. One example here on the left-hand side is that we developed a report around how capital markets can really support SMEs in terms of accessing financing. We'll send out that report to the group here today for further interest. We've also been very active in a number of areas. So we've been working with the World Federation of Exchanges around how exchanges can support SMEs. We've been very active in terms of thought leadership with the European Investment Bank, the Association for Financial Markets in Europe. We are a regular thought speaker at a number of conferences. We presented at the Europlace in Paris, the Economic Week in Europe. So a lot of our insights and thought leadership is really being communicated across the globe. And this is something that we're very keen to utilize and help the UAE in terms of its thinking around SME support going forward.
So I think, based on the graphics, I don't need to sell that idea of why SMEs are important. I think everyone here is here because they believe SMEs are important. But we have a few pages that just cover a little bit how we see the SME market in the UAE and how we see it in other places in the world. So Paul will walk us through some examples from other jurisdictions. But first, if we start in the UAE, I think there's lots of ways to define what an SME is. But their contribution to the GDP and their contribution to employment is huge everywhere. And the UAE is no different. In 2014, SMEs accounted for 92% of all businesses in the UAE, 60% of the GDP, and 86% of the private sector employment. So we know that this is a very important sector for driving the UAE economy. It's an integral part of the development of the UAE private sector, and it helps us speed up diversification away from hydrocarbons. So all this, everyone here in this room knows this, but we also know that these entities are underserved today. In addition, for the UAE specifically, this links directly to the 2021 vision. Okay, so the national agenda of the UAE hits SMEs as a key area. In the words actually of the national agenda, His Highness, the Prime Minister says, unlocking the potential of nationals as a driving force for the UAE economy comes from this segment. So we know that it's critical. And we know from one of the strategic priorities, the competitive knowledge economy, that some of the key performance indicators are directly affected by the SME market. Right? So we've got the non-oil real GDP growth, global competitiveness index, the ease of doing business, the SME's contribution to GDP, and the global entrepreneurship development index. All this directly impacted by the SME market. So the access to funding, though, is not unique to the UAE or the Middle East. This is a global occurrence. SMEs face significant challenges in accessing finance. We know that depending on how you measure SMEs and how you track the size, we know that the funding gap could be anywhere between 1.5 trillion and 3.5 trillion US dollars globally. So there's a huge gap. And the restricted access to finance was cited by SMEs as the greatest constraint to their growth. Now, the UAE has some particular, personality. There's some additional areas, constraints to the SME market here. Traditional financing is a bit more constrained in the Middle East in general. The cost of listing on exchanges is blocking or constraining the UAE SMEs. Significant information requirements, so the requirement process for listing on UAE exchanges is too high for these SMEs to list. The absence of alternative finance options and the limited success of some crowdfunding or alternative investments also restricting the ability of SMEs to access financing. And then finally, the absence of a bankruptcy code or a modified bankruptcy code to encourage SMEs. All these alternative financing solutions, all these are making it restrictive or constraining the SME market. So an alternative alternative financing solution is required to support these SMEs going forward. So Paul will take us through some examples of other jurisdictions as well and how it's done beyond the Middle East.
So what is being done in other markets, really for the capital markets to play a more prominent role in supporting SMEs access to financing. What we've done on this page is just segment some of the capital market solutions that you see in other jurisdictions. On the left-hand side, the SME equity platforms. These are typically secondary markets or second tiers that have been established on the main stock exchange within each market. You also have examples such as AIM, which is essentially a focused alternate investment market, which is really targeted purely at growth companies and SMEs. If you take AIM as a particular example, it's been in place for over 20 years now. Over the course of that 20 years, they've been able to list 3,600 growth companies or SMEs. It has been able to help raise close to $100 billion in financing for these institutions. And over the course of that 20 years, there's been a number of companies that have initially listed on AIM that have progressed through to the main stock exchange and on the London Stock Exchange. So this does show you examples of how such a secondary market can have significant benefits, not only on the direct economy, but also supportive of the stock exchanges that already exist in the market in terms of additional companies that come through and can support the market, the overall market development. The other examples here, so SME debt platforms, they're still very much in their infancy. SMEs are predominantly using equity financing still, although given the low interest rate environment, debt type platforms have become more attractive in recent years. And then on the right-hand side is what we term as alternate trading venues. So these are typically focused more on the earlier stages of the development life cycle of an SME. So crowdfunding type platforms such as Pinpoint, Funding Circle have become very successful in a number of markets, and really enabling some of the smaller SMEs to access investors and create financing solutions over and above typical bank financing, which, as Ibrahim mentioned, in most markets has become more constrained and more challenging for these types of institutions to be able to access financing through those mechanisms. So I think in terms of where we see the direction, I think that the equity platform or secondary markets is really, I guess, the priority that most countries are focusing on. However, what you're seeing is that alternate listing venues are becoming more popular. You have examples such as the London Stock Exchange and Deutsche Börse, who are actually creating an SME ecosystem, which enables both the alternate type venues as well as the SME equity platforms, which essentially enables those exchanges to bring in SMEs at a very early point in their development life cycle. You support them through alternate financing arrangements. They then progress onto a secondary type market platform. And then over time, as they grow in terms of size and sophistication, they become prime candidates to then migrate to the main board. So that complete ecosystem is certainly what we see as some of the best practices that other markets are moving towards. Just looking at how some of the more successful secondary markets have evolved, you can see that typically you need a core set of listings from day one to really be able to launch the secondary market successfully. And typically this would be in the range of 10 to 20 listings that we would look to target as an initial launch. You can see from some of the more successful exchanges such as AIM, there have been a rapid growth in the number of listings on that secondary platform. AIM roughly grew over 5 years to 350 listings. Today they have close to 1,500 listings over the last 20 years. So a significant growth, and I think what you want to create is a marketplace that is attractive to new listings on a regular basis and to really grow and develop the overall market. One example that we wanted to look at here is that although there are a number of successful examples of secondary markets, there are also obstacles and failures that we have seen. having the Neue Markt here, which was essentially a secondary market created on the Deutsche Börse platform back in the 90s. Although it grew very quickly, only lasted for 4 years before it was essentially closed down. And there are a number of rationale and reasons why the Neue Markt failed. Picking out a few of those. I mean, firstly, the regulatory supervision was not as strong as it could be. There was also a big push to try and get as many companies listed on the Neue Markt as possible at the early stages. And effectively, a number of the listing requirements were not necessarily upheld. So you had a big influx of companies who were not necessarily ready to be listed on a secondary market platform. Also on the investor side, it became a mass investor type market, so there were no restrictions in terms of focusing on institutional type investors. It was available to the mass market, and what it became was almost a day trading mechanism without necessarily having an education to the mass market of what types of stocks they were investing in. There were also examples of fraud, insider trading. All of this really negatively impacted the publicity of the platform. And then I think also critical was the timing of the launch and then the subsequent years of the Neue Markt. Essentially attracted a lot of tech companies, and then the tech boom hit in the late 90s. And obviously that had a significant negative impact in terms of the stocks which were listed on the market. So all of these factors essentially led to the demise of the Neue Markt. I think also a number of lessons learned that potentially looking at setting up a secondary market in the UAE, there's a number of key considerations that we would obviously factor in and learn from examples such as the Neue Markt.
One point that perhaps highlights, Paul, if I may, is that there is an interesting and a very fine balance and tension one needs to work through. Clearly, in order to bring SMEs onto a market, one needs to lower the requirements as compared to a main board. But on the other hand, as the failure of the Neue Markt illustrates, if you take that too far, the credibility of the market is in danger and can therefore also lead to a failure. So it's a very fine balance between lowering the cost of compliance and the threshold of listing to a point where it becomes possible for the SMEs while maintaining the sustainable credibility of the market. And getting that right requires the sort of experience of having seen it either succeed or fail in many places.
Absolutely. And then that links to the next page, which if you look at some of the challenges that SMEs face and why in other markets they not necessarily use capital markets for financing solutions, I think there's a number of key factors in causing this. One is around listing requirements. So clearly SMEs don't necessarily have the resources, the capabilities, the finances to meet all of the requirements that typically companies need to provide to join a main stock exchange. So really having lighter listing requirements, again, going back to what Dominic was just pointing out, this doesn't mean to say that you're not in control, you're not supervising, you're not having the transparency on what types of information the companies are providing. But there needs to be a balance in terms of what is currently required to join a main stock exchange and the types of information that you collect from an SME to join a secondary market. The link to that is the listing process. Typically, to IPO on a main stock exchange, it's time-consuming, as well as requiring a lot of cost and resourcing. So again, the success factors that we've seen in other markets is to make that listing process short, streamlined, and as efficient as possible. And I think where you can leverage nominated advisors, for example, or some of the financial institutions to work with SMEs to help support them in terms of some of the disclosure requirements and supporting them through the IPO process can be very successful in terms of encouraging them to such markets. The third point links to what I was talking about. Typically, from our studies previously, when we've talked to SMEs or family offices across the region, there is typically a reluctance from particularly the family offices to give away significant amounts of information on their businesses. And again, I think this links to having the right level of information without necessarily being too deep in terms of going into their business, but having the comfortable level of transparency that you can regulate the market and the investors had enough information to make credible decisions whether to invest. The fourth point is around costs. Typically, listing on a main stock exchange is very costly. We did some analysis, and typically this would be around the $200,000 mark if you factor in the initial listing costs, the ongoing listing requirements, the cost of auditors, management consultants, potentially financial advisors. All of that cost to be able to list on a stock exchange is extremely expensive for such small and medium-sized institutions. So looking at the fee structure and the ongoing compliance requirements for secondary markets clearly needs to balance that. And as you'll see from most secondary markets, the fee structure is typically around 50% of what the main stock exchange would be. And then finally, the lack of liquidity. This has really been a constraint to some of the secondary markets around the globe. It's really developing that liquidity to make it a viable trading platform that really encourages investors to come and trade, as well as allowing companies the opportunity to have a wide spectrum of investors investing in their business. And again, picking out some of the success factors from other markets, you really need to develop liquidity enhancing mechanisms to support the markets. This could be through the introduction of market makers, or potentially setting up a liquidity fund that is used to really enhance the overall liquidity of the secondary markets. So these are some of the, I guess, kind of key considerations and success factors that would need to be assessed as part of any design for a secondary market in UAE. So I guess coming to why you would even consider setting up a secondary market for the UAE market. Obviously, over and above supporting SMEs in terms of access to financing, there are also a number of additional benefits that a broader set of stakeholders across the market would essentially receive. There's obviously a positive impact to the overall economy. The numbers that you see here were based on some calculations we did in our previous study, but I mean, you're talking a significant uplift to the overall GDP. This is not necessarily directly through the platform, but all of the secondary order effects in terms of the growth and enhancement of the SME community. And again, linking that to the overall vision of supporting the development of the UAE economy over time. For the regulator, there's clearly benefits of having greater transparency on the unlisted markets, in terms of having the transparency on some companies that would come through to a secondary market. For the investor community, there would be a broader set of companies and investment opportunities, not only the large blue chip companies that you can invest in the UAE market currently, but a diversified set of institutions and a broader set of companies that both the institutional and potentially over time the retail investor base could begin to invest in. For the exchanges, clearly this is a broader design question of how a secondary market would be set up. But there are benefits to the existing exchanges in terms of providing additional services to its investor base, potentially new revenue opportunities, not only from the listing and trading side, but the addition of market data or supportive services that the exchanges could be part of. And then the SME exchanges, so we know that an SME board has been set up in the UAE market to really help encourage the growth of the SME community. Clearly this could be a supportive mechanism to really drive the agenda of that SME board going forward. So this really is a platform that has a broader set of benefits across the market. This is not only going to drive benefits to the SME community, but clearly has a number of secondary effects and positive influences on the broader economy. And then finally, just to pick up a few additional points. So as well as the economic benefits that we've kind of highlighted in terms of the growth and benefits to the SME community and the broader economy. We see limited impact to the existing services and revenue streams that exist. So if you look at the SME community, we broadly see that there's something around 350,000 SMEs that exist across the UAE, from micro businesses through to medium-sized entities. Typically, even the most successful stock exchanges, if you look at AIM or TMX in Canada, they typically have somewhere around the 1,000 to 2,000 listings. So even as the total community base of the SMEs in the UAE, that is a small slice that you're moving towards a more formalized secondary market. So any existing fee structures that exist for some of the unlisted markets, we don't see as a significant negative impact, but obviously supporting new revenue streams potentially for the exchange community. And I think that kind of links to the bottom point, which is, as well as having listings of SMEs, there are peripheral revenue opportunities that can be created, not only from additional data services around data warehousing, advanced analytics on some of these companies, but also, as we've seen from the examples of the LSE and the Deutsche Börse growth market development, is that these are becoming ecosystems that essentially link financial advisors, lawyers, consulting firms, audit firms, investors into a holistic community. And I think the ability to create something that's centralized and regulated by the SCA and supportive of the broader capital markets infrastructure, clearly bringing all of that together has significant benefits for the market, as well as potentially the exchanges that would house this platform. So we see a broad set of benefits in creating such a platform for the market. And the next few pages, I guess, kind of talk about some of the key design questions that we think need to be answered before moving forward, as well as how we would construct the work in terms of the next steps that need to be looked at to really formalize the feasibility and the blueprint for such a platform.
So as Paul said, I think some of these, so the next step before you can get into actually the design of such a platform is to answer some key questions. So here what we've listed is some of the key questions from discussions we've had in the past, and some, I don't even want to call them hypotheses, but some thoughts on different areas that we understand as being critical to the design of such a platform. Some of this work, I mean, a lot of this has come out of our work in Europe, in Asia, most recently in Saudi Arabia, where we helped them design their SME market, which is currently under process. So a lot of this comes from experience, not from a sort of desktop analysis. But the three key questions that need to be addressed. The first one is, what are the key requirements for an SME marketplace? And for this, there's a number of key elements, must-haves, that we need to agree on upfront. So some examples of what this includes is the critical number for listings. So Paul mentioned this a little bit. To launch a market without having listings is just a recipe for failure. So agreeing internally, what does this mean? And this requires an analysis of the market, discussions with the market, potentially workshops, and so on, to understand what is that number. Is it 10? Is it 20? What is our floor below which we decide to not go ahead with the platform? Agreeing on the information transparency. So what do we need to do? What does the market require from us to ensure that market confidence stays high? What is the transparency? What is the corporate governance? How do the different regulators and exchanges and government entities work together? Right? So that needs to be clear up front. It needs to be communicated up front. Do we need market makers? What kind of market makers do we need? Or other liquidity enhancement mechanisms? And how do we bring these on board? And are they required up front, or are they required for the entire time of that market, the existence of that market? How do we link into the existing post-trade infrastructure? This firstly helps de-risk a little bit. It adds to the confidence. But how do we link into what exists today? What is DFM and ADX using today? How can we link into it? Okay, so the second question is around the operating model. So based on our understanding of these key requirements, we can start talking about the operating model. Right? So we have to understand if we're talking about setting up a new market platform, or is it going to be a secondary market on one of the existing exchanges? So will this exchange sit under DFM? Will it sit under ADX? Will it be something that cuts across both, or will it be something that's completely new? These kind of decisions need to be made up front, because that changes the design, the blueprint process quite significantly. The third question is, of course, based on the first two, the outcomes of the first two, which is what type of regulatory structure will be required? Will we put in place a strong regulatory structure where it comes top down? Does ESCA have to also monitor, supervise the SMEs, or will we do a light touch approach, maybe using the AIM approach of using nomads, for example? These different elements are critical up front. So we need to make these decisions, have this discussion before you can start through the design phase. So once we've had these discussions, then the approach is quite straightforward. It's sort of a three-phase approach. First is a feasibility study.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very extensive and very detailed also. And we also leave with some challenges in it. But I'd like to comment on one area that we have mentioned at the start of the presentation. And that is mainly on the common platform for the listing. At the level of GCC, I assume this is what you are trying to address. And mainly on the single jurisdiction, because there has been some discussion on this regard with other areas at the level of the ministers in the GCC. And I think this is strategic. There's two levels of this. One is to establish a proper platform within the country itself, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, others. And I see both UAE and Saudi Arabia, the most mature ones to address such an issue, and maybe to adopt it also. And then hopefully come up with this common platform where the single jurisdiction somehow is created. The second comment I have is one of the slides you have shown the definition of SMEs. And through that, you have come with some kind of conclusion on the size and many other issues also. Just about 3-4 weeks, we have received approval of the definition of SMEs as the way it would be here in the UAE. This has been approved, so I think maybe we'll pass it to you and you can do some kind of update, because that will help you also on really defining what do we mean by SMEs in terms of the capital, in terms of turnover, also in terms of the numbers of employees, men and maximum, for both micro, small, and medium. So from the strategic point of view, I think this is very important steps towards moving on also with the others. Here, of course, today, thank you also once again for being with us, and this has been done out of goodwill from your side, as per my understanding.
Yes, of course.
And to comment on this, because I wanted to make sure that we have the right stakeholder here with us, including, of course, from the central bank. We have the governor with us here, and we have also a representation of the different small and medium-sized enterprise directors, general managers, and so on, as well as representation from the economic departments from the different areas. And of course, many other also federal and local government representation. So I'd like to use this opportunity because your presentation has been very clear, very transparent, and as I said, it leaves us with some challenges. One of the areas that is we need to make a decision on based on your comment is that there is a challenge of making a success out of it. Based on the performance of the markets, as it was shown, some of them had their problems, their challenges. And somehow we need to minimize the risk of this failure. And to do that, to achieve that, we need to be very careful about the steps that need to be taken, but all the stakeholders has to be involved, whether it's the federal level, or the local levels, or others also. So the challenge is how we come up with the most perfect formula to make sure that we succeed with this kind of markets. So with this comment, I do believe that one of the most important factors for the start of the study is the analytical process, the first one, where the analysis of the focus market platform and what are we going to do based on the landscape that we already have or existed here in the UAE. Because it's unique, it's different than Saudi, for example, simply because we are federal. And I want that formula, that side of it, to be taken into consideration when we do this kind of study. With this, I would like to maybe ask my colleagues, if somebody has any comments or any questions that we would want to ask.
First, I'd like to stress this is an important subject for all of us, and I think, just to be frank, we have been going into circles all along. I think it's time now that the ministry has really taken leadership to lead this project, and I am personally very committed to make sure that this is really a success story. In order for us to be successful, I think we have to really look at the holistic, have a holistic view on the sector. And that is not only about the listing, it's about the ecosystem. You know, when, depending on the size of the company. All these large companies at one stage they started small and then they progress. We need to see at what level we will have this listing and at what level we will have this regulation, because the listing requirement, the regulation will be requiring these entities to really put resources to have the auditor, the consultants, because at the end of the day, don't forget one thing in our market, it's driven by retail investors, not institutions. So anything you put on a platform and sell it to them, they might have a herd following mentality. So they might all go into this sector and start buying, and at the end of the day, we as regulators, as government, are responsible for all this. So it is very crucial to really outline and define at what stage these companies are ready to be listed. So, and there is the phase that is prior to that, which is, I think, also very important for us to support, because any company will have to start small and then evolve. So with that, you know, comes the government support, not in terms of funding, but in terms of easing up regulation, easing up admin processes, cost. Yeah, it all translates into cost. And then opening it up also for the venture capitalists, the private equity funds, to really be part of this, this sector, because these people, they are investing their money and their clients' money. So they will only put money into ventures they see. The risk is huge here. I mean, if banks fail, I mean, the SME sector, we have seen some issues in banking in terms of lending. I cannot really put this on a platform and let an investor who is behind their screen and just pushing a key to invest in a company.
Yeah.
While the bank could not really assess, I mean, with their mind and their credit team could not assess. So we have to really be careful about looking at this. So we have to have the funds participating. We have to have some sort of guarantee fund maybe to incentivize the banks to lend, because if the banks are asked to lend and the rule of the game is the same as the other corporates or GREs, they will be more comfortable to lend to GREs and corporates rather than SMEs, especially that they have been burned recently.
Yeah.
to some extent. It's a small in terms of exposure, but they have had their lessons. So I think we need to look at the holistic view and then go into the details. And without covering the holistic view and all elements of the details, I think the study will be lacking.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think one of the points, which was also with all the points that you made, I agree totally with that. One area that we need to make sure of, to be highlighted in the study also, is the impact of the SMEs and also the system on the overall picture of the economy. Because eventually also, and with the comment that we have heard from His Excellency on the challenges and the risk on the banking sector, you have also to look at it as an opportunity future ones. Because SMEs, as some of the statistics we have shown, are a major contributor to the GDP of the country. Actually, they are a major growth element percentage into the GDP of the country. So that has to be taken into consideration while we do this kind of study. Meanwhile, I look at the figures of the numbers that we are suggesting 10 to 20 initially. This is relatively small if you take into consideration we are talking about 350,000 SMEs. But I also understand the other side of it is how I manifest. I make sure that whoever gets in at least should be secured enough to be in there. But eventually, this could be a much bigger sort of window introducing SMEs and building more confidence in this market, by which some of these adjustments happen there is creating its own sort of body to manage and to overlook and monitor this kind of operation.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdul Basit Janahi. I'm the CEO of Dubai SME. And in 2010, actually, we had done a similar comprehensive study about the secondary market, hoping that with the people that we're supporting, and that they have reached a significant size that we can really take them public. And this really was driven from an idea in 2000 of having what Dubai economy needs to be, and the dot-com burst, startups, and the whole ecosystem that was looking at, was being planned for Dubai. So during that period, we looked at this and we had an attempt. But prior to this, and I totally agree with His Excellency the Governor about the things that needs to be in place holistically, and some fixes that needs to be done, or introduction of the specific policies that really prepares everyone. I insist on this word, preparation of people who are going to be listed and the investors themselves. I'll give you an example. So the question was why we don't have a secondary market. I went and met Isa Kalam, and then Jeff Sanger was there. I think he was the CEO of the BFM and Nasdaq Dubai. Then the question of the feasibility of the stock market was raised. How many companies we can list? To be honest, we didn't have an answer. That's why we came back to the drawing board. We created something that really covers in terms of lack of information, like the SME 100. We said who's there, who wants to be listed. As you remember, then we had one case of Damas being listed, and the issue of Damas, what happened. It had a negative effect on everyone. Out of the SME 100, again, we've pushed a company that was raising around, I think, 400 million. And we realized then that we need to take an SME to the stock market. It's a very expensive exercise. One, it's expensive not only from a regulatory point of view. It's really, you have to feed, I was just telling the minister, you have to feed people who are used to the big listing. So the lawyers, the underwriters, and for them this is insignificant. So actually they kill it before even it reaches any place. So the idea what AIM did is having the nomads, and actually it creates another market of lawyers, financial consultants, XYZ, who can help that kind of segment that can go there. And the other outcome was really the preparedness of these entities or these SMEs. Talking about corporate governance, if they go listed, it means that they do not have their own decision like they used to, of waking up in the morning and there is a deal, and this is how they work. That there is a deal out there and not to draw money and go buy that building or buy. This is how they do it. Then it's a totally different. There is a huge preparation that needs to be done. So really, I draw just a quick looking at what we've been trying to do since 2010. We believe when it comes to policy, there are preparing of having such a stock market when it comes to getting the private equity really involved before, because there is some sort of preparedness of how to deal with the capital markets that can be done from the private equity. And actually then they can come in and really finance the going public, preparing them in terms of corporate governance, how you need to manage their businesses, that listen, this is not only you now, there are other people, and that sort of things. The other thing is really, and I think this is needed, looking at, I was somehow involved when Beehive was being created, which is till date is not regulated, and there is a question mark in terms of where they are and what they do. As a model, it's a great model. I think we need a policy that really helps crowdfunding to be established over here in the UAE. One last point is we did a financing study and we ranked the banks in terms of what are the best banks who lend to SMEs, because it was very important for us. Looking at what the crowdfunding or what the public is doing, because really we've identified there's around 7 to 8 billion dirhams worth of transactions that happen really outside the banking system between the SMEs themselves. So crowdfunding policy related, is it feasible? We think it is, because what happened with my limited understanding of the banking sector and what happened recently on the skips, that a lot of these SMEs really take money, they get lending, and they don't only use it for their own operations, and they become sub-lenders at a higher rate too. So in terms of the study, yes, I think it's about time, but I totally agree with the governor. This is just one pillar of the holistic approach for the overall ecosystem.
My name is Rashid Mahmoud from Embassy Development Bank. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your detailed presentation, even though it was in a short time. We are looking at the UAE in a whole, so there are different stakeholders. We could have the federal, the government, semi-government, banks. So it's very important to identify the role of each of these stakeholders and see how they can add value to make this a success. This could take us into one-on-one discussions. It could be a workshop like this. I think where each one of you can highlight some of the challenges they see through their interaction. Because still now we don't see one global maybe study on SMEs when we talk about the UAE market. Maybe some banks they do their own studies, but still it is a separate studies. And each of those banks, or even some of the government, will make their own studies for a particular purpose. So maybe when we talk about this initiative, I think there must be some kind of all of the stakeholders, they start involved together to try to see how we can make this a success. As Emirates Development Bank, For sure, we have our own objective, we have our own strategy, but we'd like to see initiatives like this actually really works, and we'd like to see them as soon as possible. So the only way that I think we should be also interacting with this maybe from day one, once we see maybe a clear roadmap there, outline there, and then we can really answer. So as a support, I think it is there from the Emirates Development Bank to ensure this takes us to at least to achieve one of those goals when we look at how we can support these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all of your comments. All that's very helpful indeed. Maybe a couple of closing remarks, if I may. Just as I understand from your comments the general desire to view this particular question of an SME exchange in a broader policy context, and that is absolutely appropriate, as we mentioned in introducing. In many cases where we've worked with governments on this, that's exactly what we've done. We started with the broader policy context. We focused in on the various funding options, and then the SME market is one pillar of the solution to the overall problem that one might then end up with. Also take away from your comments the overriding importance of engaging all of the different stakeholders very, very early on to understand their contributions and what their needs are in terms of the solution in order to participate, either as investors or as companies to be listed in such a scheme. And as for the last one, absolutely, one needs to look at, and indeed we have in the document that we've got here a few copies of the more detailed document with benchmarks, which we will be happy to mail around to all participants at a greater level of prescriptiveness and detail on these success factors with relevant benchmarks. So I hope that sort of captures the comments. There's clearly a lot of depth and thought and experience in this matter in the room, and we very much look forward, should that be of interest to you, to continue that conversation through Your Excellency and the SCA. We've got a few more copies, as I said, of the detailed document here. We are also happy for anybody who's got additional time to stay on and talk about some of the case studies and benchmarks. But I do understand that some of you have other commitments now, and so I think it remains for us to say thank you very much for your attention and for your time.
Thank you.